Um, so as you mentioned, my name is Travis Shaddox. I'm in University of Kentucky here in Lexington, and what I do is nutrition and fertilizers, primarily with granular and foliar fertilizations. And so what this presentation is a brief condensation or not condensation, a condensed version of the presentation that I give a 4-hour workshop at the Golf Industry Show. And so for those of you who are able to attend that, thank you for attending that. And those of you who have not or cannot attend those shows, this is a condensed version of that. So efficient fertilizer blending for turf grass. So I've looked through some of the previous presentations, and we've had presenters here on this series that discuss soil testing and so forth, and proper calibrations and interpretations and so forth. Well, I'm going to take some of that information and blend it into this webinar that talks about taking that soil test information and creating a fertilizer blend that is as efficient as we know how to make it currently. Okay, so efficient fertilizer blending for turf grasses. So the outline we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about formulations. What is a formulation? We're going to talk specifically about 6 elements: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then iron, manganese, and magnesium. And at the very end, at the end of the presentation, we're going to have one slide that has a step-by-step formulation process that I think most people may be able to follow. And if you know a lot about it, you can follow it and get a good blend. And if you don't know a lot about it, you should be able to still follow the step-by-step process and come up with a blend that is hopefully more efficient than the current one you're using. Or perhaps you're already using a very efficient formulation, and it will simply confirm that the one you're using is an evidence-based formulation. Okay, so what is a formulation? A formulation is the process of blending raw materials together that results in a finished blend. So for those who aren't in the fertilizer business, what you'll do when you receive a fertilizer on your end, it's going to have some formulation number on there on the fertilizer bag. And that's a result of numerous components in that fertilizer that have been individually blended together. So for example, in this slide here, we see DAP, which is diammonium phosphate, and we see urea, and then we see filler, and all 3 of these are blended together to come up with one final product that the consumer on their end would apply. Okay, so that's the formulation process, figuring out how we add these certain components together to come up with a specific fertilizer. Okay, but when we're formulating for efficiency, we have to ask at least 2 questions. Does the material benefit the turf? And how much does that benefit actually cost to the consumer? So in this presentation, we're going to be talking a lot about that. What we reserve for other presentations are how those finished products or the raw materials have, what their influence is on, say, phytotoxicity or environmental risk, and other criteria that are important for consideration. But in this presentation, we'll only be looking at the benefit to the turf and how much does that benefit cost. So granular fertilizer formulation, BMPs. These are sort of general. They're not necessarily universally accepted or codified into law or anything. These are just best management practices that or 2 or 3 best management practices that if you can understand and implement, generally speaking, you will either confirm what you're using is sound, or you can adjust your current program to fall more in line with efficient fertilizer usage. So the first BMP is to formulate the fertilizer in a way that minimizes waste. And so what do I mean by waste? When I speak of waste in the world of fertilizer, I'm speaking primarily of filler, which is a component that needs to be added to many fertilizers to make the analysis specifically to what you've requested as a consumer. Waste can also be any element that does not result in a beneficial turf grass response. So for example, under normal conditions, there's extremely rare circumstances that a turf would respond to copper or boron or zinc or cobalt. These are all essential elements, but the turfgrass response to these elements is either never been observed or is so rare that it does not necessarily justify a universal inclusion into a fertilizer blend. Filler can also be any unnecessary phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, iron, or manganese. So when I say unnecessary, it may be you're putting too much in the blend, or you're putting more in the blend than the turfgrass can utilize. The same thing goes with excessive. You're putting more in there than the turfgrass can consume. And it can be any form of an filler can also be, or waste can also be any form of an element that is not or will not be soluble within a growing season or consumed within a growing season. And those are primarily oxide forms of the elements. So for example, you may be applying iron sulfate, which is a soluble iron source, but that will rapidly convert into iron oxide. So the form iron oxide is unavailable. Same thing with, say, manganese oxides or magnesium oxides. These forms are not going to be available to the plant to consume within the growing season for sure. At some point, geologically speaking, I'm sure they will be solubilized and be available, but for our purposes, they're unavailable, meaning they will not normally result in a turf response. And then the second BMP is balance the nitrogen, potassium, or the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium for maximum effectiveness. And we're going to talk about that, some of the work that's been done primarily in Florida, but in some other places about what is the proper ratio or balance of these elements when blended in fertilizer. Okay, so we'll be discussing only these 6 elements: NPK, iron, manganese, magnesium. If you have interest in other elements, I'm happy to discuss those. I'll just say that under normal conditions, with the exception of lime, let's say you're trying to adjust pH, that's certainly a valid application. But with the exception of, say, lime or sulfur, where you're trying to adjust pH, the application of other elements almost never results in a direct response. So we're not going to really go into those, but I'm happy to discuss them if you have questions. So I'm going to skip through this, I guess, because I try to put in a poll. If you're there, you can try to do this. Follow the text at the top, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't work. I tried to get it to work in Spain, and for some reason I can't seem to get this to function.
Okay, do you want me to put this in the poll? Yeah,
we
can try. Okay, which is the most? Okay, de acuerdo. Vale, let me speak in Spanish. Lo que vamos a hacer ahora es una pregunta, vale, es una encuesta. ¿Vale? Que la iniciamos, ¿de acuerdo? Pues ya podéis ver en la pantalla que sale cuál es la materia prima más utilizada en fertilizantes y ordenadores en los campos de golf. ¿Vale? Pues vosotros, cada uno en su pantalla puede escoger la opción que considere, ¿vale? Y entonces lo que hacemos, bueno, pues es una forma un poquito más, que da un poco más de interactividad al asunto, ¿de acuerdo? Vale, bueno, de momento he votado. Yeah, you cannot see the poll because I don't know exactly why, because you are a panelist and you are not able to see this. I don't know. Well, I will have to find out why.
That's okay. Well, like I said, we can.
Okay, I will. Yes, I will tell you the results right now. Ya, de momento el 31% votado, nos esperamos un poquito más y a ver si vota mínimo 50%, que sea un resultado válido.
There's only 2 of these, so this one and one more, so it shouldn't be too much.
Okay, I'm waiting because just 30% of attendees have voted. So let's wait just for a while. Okay. Puede ser que el doctor Travis me comentaba que si estáis utilizando el móvil de algún problema. O sea que, bueno, lo damos. Llevamos 1 minuto 45, a los 2 minutos cerramos la votación. Pues bueno, de momento tiraremos adelante con estos resultados. De acuerdo, pues ya la cierro en 3, 2, 1. Vale.
We're good?
Yes, let me explain to you. No, sorry.
Well, it's okay. I don't necessarily need to know the
Yes,
numbers.
no, it's no,
Whatever the numbers are, it's fine. It's fine, Xavier. I just wanted to
yeah, no, let me tell you. Urea 60%, sulfur coated urea 20, and filler 20%.
Okay, so that may
Okay.
be the case. Okay, thank you. Yeah, that actually may be the case in Spain. You know, I don't know your blends in where you're at.
They are mainly from Spain, but there is someone from South America.
Okay, I just don't really know like what they're made of, or I'm not looking at fertilizer from Spain, so I don't know. But in the United States, which may or may not be relevant to Spain, I'm sorry, but in the United States, the number one component is actually filler. And what filler is, it's a little bit of material that you have to add into a fertilizer if it's not blended perfectly balanced. And so if you're buying a straight bag of urea, 4600, then there's no filler in it. And so if you're using that in Spain, then you're absolutely right. Urea is the number one, component of your fertilizer. But if you're not buying a raw material, you're buying a blended fertilizer. Let's say it's a, 32-4 or something. Then oftentimes those blends cannot be made without adding some filler in there, because the manner in which they're blended, they have to add something in there to take the space up if it's not completely filled. So make a long story short, is it's filler usually. But keep in mind, I don't know about Spain. But in the United States, we can break this out by state, and just based upon the best information we have, that you can see it differs based upon whether in the United States, up in Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, where it's cool season grasses in the New England area, we actually have more filler for some reason now. But as we move further south into Florida, we have less filler, and even on the West Coast, we have less filler. So filler is a wasteful component. It's necessary oftentimes. You can't get around it in many cases. But we want to try to work to eliminate that, because we're paying for it, but we're not receiving anything for it in return. It's not a nutritional component in most cases. It's just a non-nutrient carrier is all it is usually. So we want to look about how to minimize that. So this is an example of what filler is. So on the left, we see a blended fertilizer, 15015, and it looks like whatever normal blended fertilizer you'd find. And this on the right is the exact same fertilizer that has been separated. So basically, I blended this by hand, and then I left it separated out, and then I blended this and mixed it all up. And so when you're looking at fertilizer, it may look like a normal fertilizer, but the actual components, when they're separated out, you see the difference in filler. And so this bottom third here is a limestone filler that the consumer oftentimes is unaware of. They didn't realize that they're asking for a fertilizer that cannot physically be blended without including a filler component to it. And so when you see this, you realize, well, 1/3 of my fertilizer is waste, basically. And so we want to look at that and be aware of that and see if we can find a way to blend fertilizer to remove that. It helps reduce our price, our cost. Okay, so we're going to talk about nitrogen sources. We have we have a variety of different nitrogen sources, but on this list we have soluble nitrogen, we have coated or reactive nitrogen, and we have natural organic nitrogen. And these are all just examples of different nitrogen sources that exist in turfgrass management. You may or may not have these available in your locations in Spain. There may be regulations, there may not be regulations, I don't know. But these are just examples of the variety of materials that are categorized as nitrogen sources, okay? So when we look at all these, these nitrogen sources have different release characteristics, they have different price positions, and we want to know, okay, how do we fairly price these products? How do we fairly compare these nitrogen sources? And so there's a couple, 2, 3 ways to look at this. You can look at how much does a fertilizer cost per ton. Okay, so in this example on the left, we see a biosolid is less than around $400 US per metric ton, and on the far right hand we have a polymer coated urea that is close to $1,600 per ton. But that ton has a different quantity of nitrogen in it. And we're not necessarily buying the fertilizer, we're buying nitrogen. And so when we look at it on a per unit of nitrogen basis, oftentimes these prices get flipped around, where on the left you see both the natural organics are the least expensive per ton, and on the right you see both of them are far exceed and are far away the most expensive nitrogen sources per unit of nitrogen, whereas urea now is the least expensive because it's the highest percent. It just has 46 units of nitrogen, and these nitrogen sources have I guess 5 and 6 units of nitrogen. So we want to look at it on a price per unit of nitrogen basis. That's the most fair way to compare these nitrogen sources. However, if you come across some marketing material, oftentimes you'll find how is a fertilizer cost fairly compared on a cost per day of acceptable turf. So they'll say, okay, we got it broken down per pound of nitrogen, but that 1 pound or 2 pounds, in Spain, it'd be say like 49 kilograms per hectare or 98 kilograms per hectare. That kilogram of nitrogen may last longer than another kilogram of nitrogen. It may be such that you can apply 1 kilogram of nitrogen and get 2 weeks of response, or you might apply 2 kilograms of nitrogen and get 5 or 6 weeks of response. So it's not all, the claim is they're not always, it's not always fair just to say a kilogram of nitrogen, because we need to know how long that kilogram lasts. The issue is we often don't have strong data to use to compare those, that way of comparing nitrogen. We've been working on that, and I'm going to show some of that now. So if it'll go to the next slide. There we go. So what we have is we have the fertilizer price. What we don't have good data for are the days of turf quality, good days of acceptable turf. Okay, days turf quality exceeds a 6.0 on our turf quality scale. And if we had this number, then we could come up with a cost per day. Okay, so for example, urea might cost 90 cents per pound. Sorry, that's in English. And it may last 60 days. And this, but if it did, this would be our cost per day. Okay, I don't want to make things too confusing, but oftentimes this can be confusing if you're presented with this information and we don't have data to support it. So for example, we may apply a pound of nitrogen, or say 1 kilogram of nitrogen here, and it might last 110 days. We might put another kilogram of nitrogen here, it might only last 80 days. Okay, different sources might result in different longevities of quality. To compound the issue, different sources may result in increased quality. So for example, let's say you're at a course, or you're on a soccer pitch or a football pitch, and your club or your course says, okay, a quality of 6 is acceptable for me. Well, no problem, you just use these numbers. But some other courses might require a higher quality. Their members may require an 8, a 7, or an 8, or a very high quality turf grass. This is their minimum acceptable level. In those cases, we have to account for not just the longevity, but also the magnitude of response during that curve. And so that's what we've been doing here in Florida and in Kentucky. We've been measuring the longevity and the area under the curve so that we have a measure of the longevity and the magnitude during that response. And so we're going to take these numbers, and we're going to take the price per kilogram of nitrogen, and we're going to come up with cost per kilogram, or cost per day of response. So here's an example of some of the work we've been doing, where we have one application of nitrogen, and we have, then when we see the curves go up from these different sources and go down. And what we do is, as soon as the curve goes up above the minimum line, we start counting days. And then when the curve goes back down below that minimum line, we stop counting days, and we come up with a total days of response. And then we apply another round of nitrogen. We do the same thing, and then we count them again. Then we apply another round, and we do the same thing. So we come up with a total annual days of response from each one of these sources that you see here, whether it's urea or ammonium sulfate or polymer coated ureas or natural organics. Okay, so turf grass response to nitrogen source. So now we have some numbers now. We've done this work, as I just showed on this slide. We didn't have these numbers for a long time. Now we have at least some numbers that we can include into that equation and come up with a balanced assessment of the actual cost. And so that's what we're going to do. So the longevity, what we find is, so this is J, Florida, which is more similar to, say, Seville or Costa del Sol in Spain. And this is Fort Lauderdale, which is a more tropical environment. It's not really a part of Spain that this location is similar to. It's probably more similar to, say, like maybe Cairo or some parts of like Northern Africa. It's more of a tropical environment. This is more similar to what you would experience in Spain, in the southern part of Spain. So what we see is when we apply all these products and we add all those days together, we don't see any difference among these nitrogen sources, okay? They all result in acceptable turf grass, whether we applied urea or whether we applied polymer-coated urea, sulfur-coated urea, regardless of the source, every source resulted in acceptable turf grass for the same longevity in that location. And the same occurred in Fort Lauderdale. When we look at the longevity as a function of the magnitude of response, or in other words, the area under the curve, we see a little bit of difference, where we see the polymer-coated urea duration actually resulted in a greater area under the curve than urea and Uflex. And in the tropical environment that we did this study in, we saw some separation, but in this case, it was the soluble nitrogen sources that resulted in a greater area under the curve than the reacted ureas. So we do see some differences when we're looking at longevity and magnitude, but not when we look at just longevity. So now we have this. We have the price of the fertilizer, which you can get from your salesman, and now we have the days turf quality exceeded 6. Now, is this relevant in every condition? No, it's not. I don't know what's going to happen in northern Spain, in Barcelona, or in Madrid, or in Seville. I don't know in every condition in Spain whether these longevities and whether these areas under the curve are going to be the same. However, excuse me, I'm a little under the weather. However, this is all we have to go on for now. And so until those studies are done and conducted in those environments, the best we can do is rely upon the evidence that we have. And the only evidence that I'm aware of is what I've just presented you. So we're going to go with that. So now when we look at the cost per day of acceptable turf, in South Florida at 49 kilograms per hectare, we see that the least expensive source was urea and sulfur-coated urea, being this is the soluble source, this is the slow release source. When we look at 98 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, it's the same. Okay, so regardless of the rate of nitrogen, urea and sulfur coat were the least expensive soluble and slow release in South Florida in a tropical environment. That's probably not analogous to conditions in Spain. When we look at situations that are more similar to Spain, we see a very similar result. Urea is the least expensive soluble source, and sulfur-coated urea is the least expensive slow release source. Ammonium sulfate is another soluble source. So when we're looking at slow release or we're looking at soluble, these two remain the least expensive at 49 kilograms per hectare and even at 98 kilograms per hectare. So we see a similar result. Okay, so the point here is when we're looking at efficiency, cost of the effect, however you slice that, that question up, whether it's cost per pound of N or whether it's cost per day of response, urea continues to be the least expensive nitrogen source, and sulfur-coated urea continues to be the least expensive slow release source. So until additional evidence is presented, we're going to go with these two sources, knowing that the other nitrogen sources will result in an acceptable turf as well. They're only going to cost more money to achieve that response. They also come with additional benefits. So for example, polymer-coated ureas or natural organics may have a much lower burn potential than, say, sulfur-coated urea or urea. They may have other additional benefits, but you're going to pay for that benefit. It's not going to be the same price or cost to you as urea or XCU. It's going to be more. That's the point. So when we look at the purchase price versus cost per day of response, this is what we paid for it. And on the y-axis here, we see fold increase from urea. So this is the magnitude greater in terms of cost compared to urea. So for example, if the material was less than urea, then we would see these bars less than 1. So in the case when we're just buying it straight up on a pounds price per kilogram of nitrogen, we see that XCU is roughly 1.5 times more expensive than urea. And we see, in this case, milorganite is roughly 6.5 times more expensive than urea. When we include the cost per response day, we don't see much of a change. If anything, we see it go up. When we include the cost per area under the curve, so response and magnitude, we don't see any change. We don't see any reduction. If anything, we see an increase in this particular location. Okay, so it's important to acknowledge this is I'm not a believer in absolute certainty. I can't be absolutely certain that this is going to occur in every condition in Spain, on every nitrogen source, on every turf grass, on every soil. I can't be certain of that. But in the absence of additional evidence, this is all we can go by. Okay, so until someone generates more evidence and it refutes this evidence, then I'm fairly confident in these numbers, and I'm fairly confident in continuing to recommend urea as a soluble end source and XCU as the slow release end source if maximum efficiency is the goal. Okay. Okay, last in summary, each nitrogen source can result in acceptable high quality turf. That's important to know. Any of these end sources can result in high quality turf. So if you happen to just like one end source and you used it for years, great, continue to use it. Just understand that you're probably spending more for that result than you would for urea or XCU. Those two being the least expensive sources, and other sources provide value, as I mentioned, low burn, reduced leaching, and they just cost more. Okay. All right, so we're going to go to phosphorus, potassium, magnesium. So the values that I've been talking about recently for PK magnesium in terms of soil test values, I'm using the Malic 3. I don't know what soil extractant you use in Spain. I'm sorry, I don't know that. But for Malic 3 extractants, the numbers that I'm comfortable with are like 10, 40, 20 for PK magnesium. We don't have anything for nitrogen, iron, or manganese. Now, 10, 40, 20 are published in the literature on sandy warm season soils, warm season turf grass on sandy soils. Again, I can't be absolutely certain that these numbers are going to be what is in fact, the case in Spain. I don't know that, but I think it's a good number to start from. I think these are good numbers to start from, and then adjust your phosphorus, potassium, magnesium accordingly if you're seeing responses or if you're applying it and not seeing responses. Okay. So if you're familiar with MLSN, you'll find slightly different numbers, but very similar numbers. So UK is using 10, 40, 20 as just round numbers. MLSN is using 21, 37, being very close to K, and then magnesium at 47. And then they use sulfur at 7. And I think they even have calcium on there somewhere too. So this question came up before the presentation started about MLSN, and my take on MLSN is if it's resulting in greater efficient or enhanced efficiency of applied nutrients compared to the existing interpretation, then use it. Okay, so the existing interpretations oftentimes are on alfalfa or wheat or some ag crop or row crop. Okay, and that was the best evidence we had for a while. If MLSN is being used and you're finding you're reducing your nutrient inputs and still achieving the same quality turf or perhaps even better quality turf, then the result, the end is fine. The means to an end to me is satisfactory because the end result is you're becoming more efficient. However, on a scientific level, these values that we're using here, which you'll notice are very similar to the MLSN, have been properly documented and scientifically scrutinized and published. They're not, they're not exact. I can't be 100% confident that these are exactly the numbers that that you need to go by. So until we have a lot more data, I'm not going to be that confident in those interpretations. But it's the best we have to go on. So to me, I use these numbers. For end users, I don't particularly care which one you use, as long as the result is that you're finding enhanced efficiency or enhanced efficient usage of your budget and your nutrients. And so I guess that's the take on MLSN. I mean, I don't have any concern with it. I think it's a decent approach as long as the end is the result you're looking for. Okay. So how did I come up with these 10 the 10 number? A publication was sent out in 2012 by a professor in Nebraska, as well. I think in Minnesota, I think was the co-author. Anyway, they came up with Mehlich-3 phosphorus levels, visual quality, and they scaled it to 6, or they cut off the line at 6. And if you look at 10 on each one of these graphs, you'll see that the maximum turf quality plateaus at or below 10. So in other words, you can keep applying phosphorus more and more and more up if you want to, but you're not going to see an increase in quality. Okay, you're not going to see an appreciable increase when the value is above 10. I know it goes 20 here, but if you look at 10, it's still at or below the 10. Okay, so that's why I use 10, and this is on this soil with this turf, and I understand that different soils will react differently. But until something similar to this graph is created on every possible soil that turf grass managers use, I'm more comfortable using this than a theoretical value accumulated from a population of soil samples. So if you look at phosphorus in warm season grasses, you see something similar. This is Mehlich-1, which is slightly different than Mehlich-3, but you do see a similar value at 10. Granted, Mehlich-3 is going to be a little bit higher than that, but it's still somewhere around this number. And the point is that these data do exist in the literature. That may or may not be relevant, but it's at least something that we can go by until we find more relevant data in specific locations. Okay, so moving right along here. So what are some common Mehlich-3 phosphorus, potassium, magnesium concentrations in the United States? So we did a study several years ago, and we found that whether it's Ohio or all these different states, the only nutrient that we found lower than the UK recommendations, and even to some degree the MLSN recommendations, was potassium in 4 states. We did find some low phosphorus occasionally here and there, but potassium was low in 4 states. All the other states had very high magnesium, more than adequate potassium, and more than adequate phosphorus. So the point is, if you have something like this in Spain where you have soil test data over years or over locations, and you can go back and look at this, then you can kind of get an idea as to whether or not these elements are required in your fertilizer. So the next couple slides are more specific to Kentucky. I just put this on here as an example of what can be generated if Spain, or if your government agencies or your university faculty, or even turf professionals, golf course superintendents, if they have historic data that they can put into a database, you can create maps like this, and you can kind of get an idea. Hey, if my course is in this general area, there's a pretty good chance that I don't need to apply any phosphorus. Okay, whereas if my golf course is in, let's assume this is not Kentucky. Let's assume it's Spain. Let's say you say, okay, up near Barcelona, I don't have any need to apply phosphorus, for example. I don't know, but let's say, for example. Meanwhile, down near Seville or Coastal, so wherever, you may have very low phosphorus in your soils, and you may need to be more aware of phosphorus applications in your location. So I just want to throw this out as an example of how historic data can be used to give you an idea of what exists in your location. Same thing happens with potassium, where we can see we have almost no chance of seeing potassium anywhere in Kentucky. Potassium response to, or turfgrass response to potassium, almost anywhere in the whole state of Kentucky. So we're using this where I'm at, and I would encourage you all to consider, looking at databases to see if these data already exist. You may not necessarily have to go create it. It may already exist somewhere that you're unaware of currently, and you can create these from the existing data. So potassium is interesting because a great scientist up in Minnesota is doing work on potassium, and generally speaking, we'd say, oh, we would just apply potassium, even if it's low, it's no big deal, it's cheap, and we'll just apply it. But what he's finding is that on bent grass with microdochium is that the application of potassium is actually encouraging a microdochium disease. So this is an example here of a piece of turf that is untreated with potassium. Whereas as you continue to go up with potassium at 30 kilograms per hectare, we see increased disease from microdochium. And then this is the next replication here. You'll see untreated here, and the high rate of potassium at 30 kilograms per hectare here. And then the next rep, you'll see the same thing. So we're actually finding, and this is confirmation of older data in a different location as well, where they also found increased disease prevalence when potassium was applied at excessive rates in the fall, or I believe this was applied in the fall. So we want to be aware of potassium because it's not now the case that, oh, we can apply it and nothing bad happens. Environmentally, it's not known to have any negative consequences, but the turf grass and particularly diseases may actually be exacerbated by the excessive applications of potassium. So the probability of observing turf grass applied to magnesium, same sort of situation, but in this case it's magnesium. You essentially in Kentucky have 0 chance of ever seeing application or turf grass response to the application of magnesium on native soils. This isn't including obviously putting greens or sand cap sport turf or turf grass fields. Okay, so should P and K and magnesium be applied? Well, the Mehlich 3 soil test will help you determine this. In many cases, soil pK and magnesium will already be sufficient to sustain acceptable turf grass quality. And in these cases, adding pK and magnesium will not likely increase turf quality or tissue concentrations, okay? So adding more K may increase microdogium. So in most cases, under most normal conditions, the application of P and K and magnesium either is unnecessary or you only need to apply small quantities of potassium and magnesium, okay? There are clearly cases where potassium and phosphorus. There are clearly cases where phosphorus and potassium are warranted. But generally speaking, they're not, okay, on native soils. However, when you need to apply them, how should P and K be applied when soil is low? Okay. With phosphorus, diammonium phosphate, this acronym here stands for diammonium phosphate, on acidic soils, monoammonium phosphate on alkaline soils, and concentrated superphosphate on most soils. And the reason for this is these have very different reactions with the pH of the soil and a potential volatilization of the ammonium and binding of the phosphorus with either calcium, or mostly with calcium. Generally, turf grass will respond similar to most soluble P sources. DAP and CSP, which diammonium phosphate and concentrated superphosphate, are normally the least expensive sources, okay? So if you're using phosphorus, these are the 2 sources that I would consider using in terms of their maximum efficiency. With potassium, generally the form of soluble K is insignificant. However, that's the case whenever burn potential is not an issue. But burn potential is always an issue. So the primary concern with potassium is their burn potential and the differences between SPM, sulfate of potash, magnesium, sulfate of potash, or muriate of potash. These have different burn potentials. And sulfate of potash is the safest raw material that's commonly applied to turf grasses. So if you're concerned about burn, sulfate of potash is the source to use. If you're not concerned about burn, then muriate of potash or potassium chloride is the least expensive source to use, but it has a high burn potential, okay? Okay, so when we apply these, we want to apply potassium relative to our nitrogen. And so what we've done is, well, I didn't do it, another professor did it. They went out and they looked at these different nitrogen potassium ratios, and the turf quality that we're looking at is 6, and we're looking at this for over 2 years. And this blue line is no potassium applied. And the other lines are either a 2 parts nitrogen, 1 part potassium, 1 part to 1 nitrogen potassium, or 1 nitrogen, 2 potassium. So in other words, we're increasing the amount of potassium relative to nitrogen with each change in this legend. So each one of these is increasing the potassium, and we don't see any appreciable increase in quality after we have applied simply a 2-to-1 into K. And the same thing occurs with tissue K. Once you apply, this is no potassium, 1 to 0, no potassium. And then once we apply a 2-to-1, which would be like a 20-0-10 or a 30-0-15, something like that. Once we apply that potassium, we see an increase. And then we can continue to apply more and more potassium, but we don't see much appreciable increase in the tissue potassium as well. So what this is saying is when you apply potassium, when you need to apply it at a 2-to-1 ratio, nitrogen to potassium. When you need to apply phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, the rates if you're just looking at the soil test, can be difficult because we don't have very good calibration data. So what I'm recommending recently is to use these critical levels, the 10, 40, 20 pK magnesium critical levels. If your phosphorus is at 10, let's say the Mehlich 3 phosphorus level is 10 right here, you should be applying low to no phosphorus, okay? Low phosphorus or none, okay? It doesn't mean you shouldn't always apply none, because that 10 is right at that critical level. So you may be applying some phosphorus, but it's not much. Same thing goes for potassium. Let's say for potassium, this number here would be 40. You should be applying little to none. Magnesium, little to none. Okay, and then as the soil test levels decline, as they move left on the x-axis and the decline, you should be increasing the amount of phosphorus and potassium and magnesium as the soil test you're taking is lower and lower. So the lower the soil test level of these elements go, the more you should be applying. The higher they go, the less you be applying. So once you exceed these critical levels, you should be applying virtually none of these elements. If you want to apply some just to maintain, like let's say you're at 15 parts per million phosphorus or 20 parts per million phosphorus, and you want to maintain that, then apply a little bit, but it should be very little. Okay, so until we have calibration numbers where we know exactly at this soil test that we can apply exactly this amount and get this response. Until we had that, we don't have much confidence in providing a recommendation, or I don't have much confidence in providing a recommended amount. You should apply this exact amount every time. So in lieu of that, this sort of philosophy I think makes sense. Okay, so with iron, so we're going to move on to iron, micronutrients. So I'm just going to skip over the next slide, so we don't have to do a poll. Okay, I'm just going to skip over the next slide, so don't worry about it. With iron is an interesting one, where we're looking at iron solubility in soils all throughout the United States. Iron is a very common component of granular fertilizer. They want a micronutrient package and they put it in there. But what we're finding is iron, it becomes insoluble very quickly. And so when you apply iron to the soil of all these different soils that I looked at, we looked at soils from each one of these states. I think there were 10 different states, or maybe 11 different states all around the United States. And regardless of the soil, for the most part, we saw iron become insoluble within an hour of application. So when you're looking at different iron sources, oxide, of course, is insoluble, so it's not going to have any solubility within 1 hour. But humate and glucoheptanate and sulfate, which is the most common iron source in many granular fertilizers, polycyclic, all these iron sources, once they enter the soil solution, they oxidize very rapidly and form iron oxide. So we have to chelate them. Well, in many cases, many parts of the EU, these chelates are not allowed. So EDTA, DTPA, and EDHA, they greatly increase the solubility of iron in our soils. But unfortunately, many of these are not available or not allowed in the EU. So I'm not sure exactly where you're at, if it's available or not, but you need to note if these are available or not. IDHA is an organic chelate that is manufactured in northern, I can't remember, it's Northern Europe somewhere. I can't remember where it's manufactured, but it's an organic chelate, and you can see even it is very low in solubility. It has very little ability to maintain iron solubility. And so we look at 1 hour, it's almost all gone. 3 weeks later, it's again still almost all gone. Only the true chelates down here have any solubility 3 weeks after application. So the take-home message here is granular iron, unless it's chelated, which may not be allowed where you're at, is of virtually no use. Okay, I can't say that with absolute certainty, but the data continues to come in and the evidence continues to pile up, and every time it comes in, it confirms the same message, and that is granular iron sources must be chelated or they should not be used. Okay, and what happens when you apply this, you see these stains on the cart paths, around the pool decks or wherever. You'll see these stains on concrete, and this is a result of iron sulfate oxidizing to iron oxide. And you can see the same thing in the soil. You'll see these little brown stains on the soil, and these are the same thing that occurred on that sidewalk earlier. It's just the iron sulfate's oxidizing on the soil surface rather than on the concrete. You can see the same thing happen on the turf grass surface. If it doesn't go through the turf grass canopy, the iron can actually oxidize on the leaf blades and cause this darkening or blackening of the turf. Okay, so, and you can see here, this is a dark close up here where you see a dark brown or black circle, and in the center of it you'll see an iron sulfate particle. Here's another particle up here in the corner. You'll see these particles out there. So it's really a no-no when it comes to granular iron. Here's one on a putting green. This is Tiff Eagle in South Florida, where we see the same amount of iron applied as a granular and the same amount of iron applied as a foliar. So you see the response that you're looking for here, and this is no iron. You're looking for the response here, but when you spread it out as a granular, you see this mottling, and it's a result of the oxidation of that iron on the leaf surface. Here's an aerial photograph where we're applying granular and foliar iron. So the green rectangles are foliar applied iron. Each one of these rectangles is a foliar applied iron source, and all the other ones are granular applied iron or no iron. So this is a case where the turf grass was susceptible to an iron response, as evidenced by the foliar response here. But when we apply the granular, we don't see anywhere near the same response, resulting, caused by the oxidation of iron once it hits the soil solution. So if you choose to apply iron, that's fine, but do not apply it as a granular. It needs to be applied as a foliar. And my recommendation is to not exceed 6 kilograms of iron per hectare, simply because you can find a burning potential. The burning potential increases greatly when you exceed 6 kilograms per hectare. So we go on to manganese. Manganese is a little easier. Manganese does oxidize out. This is 1 hour, 4 hours, all the way to 3 weeks, soluble manganese in the soil solution. You do see some oxidation initially, but it's nowhere near the iron. And you do actually see manganese remain soluble in these soils for as long as 3 weeks. It does oxidize out over time, but this amount of iron from these bars remains soluble for plant uptake. And you can see that when you put it out in a controlled manner, where you have the lower plot here is no manganese, and the upper plot is granular manganese. Okay, so you can see that green rectangle pretty clearly there from granular manganese. Magnesium. So manganese is a valid evidence-based granular application product. Manganese is almost never deficient. So these are all the soils we find. This red line is the critical level, and all these sources all these soils have excessive amounts of magnesium, except for where I used to live down in Davie, Florida. It was low. So generally speaking, magnesium will remain soluble in soils. It doesn't oxidize out very easily, but the soils also have exceedingly high levels of magnesium, and so you really don't need to apply it except under confirmed conditions where magnesium is below this 20 to 40 parts per million sort of critical level. So when we're getting down to the end here, ratios of fertilizers. The USGA has this in their current BMP template, where we have NK ratios on US golf courses. In 2006, we were using basically 1-to-1s everywhere. In 2014, we see the greens are still the same, which is where they should be, but we see a movement in the fairway and roughs to apply less potassium, which is a great trend to see. We're seeing these blends contain less and less potassium. In other words, they're becoming more and more efficient at the usage of potassium. We're applying it in a more effective manner. So we hope to see that trend continue. Maybe in the next survey they do, we'll see this closer to, say, 1.5 or even higher. This is in the current BMP. If you're unaware, the GCSA is going through BMP manuals and creating those manuals in all 50 states, and this is part of those manuals, and you'll see the interpreting fertilizer application ratios. In essence, what they're saying is put out a 2-to-1, 8-1-4, which is a 2-to-1 N to K, but they're doing it with the inclusion of phosphorus. So in doing so, we're recommending an 8-1-4 ratio of N, P, and K. Okay, on putting greens, you may end up finding it more of a 1-to-1 ratio, where it's like 4-1-4 or something like that, or an 8-1-8 or something like that. Okay, so they recommend a 3-1-3. I'm sorry. So native soils in 8-1-4. This should be your ratio. Only when soil conditions dictate that phosphorus and potassium is needed. So if phosphorus and potassium are needed, soil test indicates they are needed, then include phosphorus and potassium in these ratios to nitrogen. On greens, we see more potassium is generally beneficial, at least under the current evidence. In your location, may recommend little to no phosphorus, potassium. So anyway, don't get hung up in the exact numbers, okay? The objective is to understand that greens require about half as much potassium as nitrogen with some phosphorus, whereas all other areas require little to no phosphorus and potassium. So just keep that in mind. Don't, oh, I got an 813, is that going to work? Or I got a 914, is that going to, yes, it'll work. Don't get hung up on the exact numbers. I'm not trying to split the atom here. We're just trying to get our ratios in balance with each other as best we can. Okay, so this is really the last slide. So this is what I recommend when people want to start blending their fertilizer efficiently. Okay, if you've gone through all this and you kind of understand the nuts and bolts of it, you kind of understand what I'm going through and explaining why we're doing certain things. This is how we're going to do certain things. Why we're going to build efficient fertilizer, why we're including elements and not including others. That's what we've gone through. This last slide, how we're actually going to take that information and create an efficient fertilizer. The first step is to start with urea. The best recommendation I can provide to most superintendents, turf managers, is just simply start with urea, 4600. Start there in every case. Then you can add in the desired slow release material that you desire. So for example, you say, okay, Travis, I understand that you confirmed that polymer coated urea is more expensive than urea. I got that, but I want polymer coated urea in my blend because I've used urea and I found it burned, or I found it grew too fast, or whatever the case is. I want polymer coated urea in there. Then include that, but have a rationale for it. Have a reason, a justifiable explanation or reason why you want to include it. You're going to pay for that. And when you pay for that, you want something in return. Okay, so add the desired slow release material you want. And when you do, this 46 is going to reduce to something. It's going to reduce to 43 or 44 or 35 or whatever. It's going to reduce to some number because you're taking urea and you're adding something to it to slow it down. Okay, that dilutes the nitrogen in the fertilizer. Okay, the next step after you've added the slow release nitrogen is add potassium if the soil test is less than 40 and not more than a 2 to 1 NK. So let's say you're at 40. I wouldn't make it a 42.021 or whatever. I mean, or 30.015 or whatever. I wouldn't just jump all the way in. I would just add in a little potassium, just 2 or 3 or 4 units of potassium. Apply it, soil test again next year, see the turf response. If the soil test is where you want it to be, great, leave it alone. If it's not where you want it to be and you want to keep increasing, then you can continue to increase the potassium a little bit more each blend until you see the soil test and your turf level off to where you want it to be. Okay, so add in the potassium if it's less than 40, no more than a 2 to 1 NK. Next step, so you can see that the analysis is slowly changing. When I added in potassium, the nitrogen had to be reduced because I added something in. Now I'm going to add in phosphorus only if the soil test is less than 10 and no more than an 8 to 1 N to P. So now I added in a little bit of phosphorus, and again, something has to be reduced. In this case, the 39 went to 36. Okay, so now I'm at a 36.13. Last, or second to last, add magnesium if the soil test is less than 20. Okay, this will almost never happen because your soil test will almost always be above that number. But if it is, and you feel the need to apply it, then apply a couple units, 1 or 2 units of magnesium. And again, the 36 has to be reduced, or some number has to be reduced. I'm reducing the nitrogen to a 34. And the last step is add manganese if desired. So if you take this slide and print it off and just put it somewhere and follow these steps, the odds are you're going to end up with a 4600 in most cases, to be honest with you, or you're going to add in some slow release and it's going to be a 4200 or a 4300 or something. In most cases, you're not going to need to apply really anything other than nitrogen and maybe a little bit of potassium. And in most cases, you're probably going to be fine with urea. And in some conditions where you justify the use of slow release fertilizer, then by all means add in the slow release material and you'll reduce it down to a 42 or 3 or 4 or whatever it might be. Okay, but start with urea and don't move off of urea unless you have an evidence-based reason to do so. That's sort of the take-home message here. Okay, and there are many evidence-based reasons to do so, as I explained, as I outlined, but just follow those and you should be as good or better than where you're at now in terms of your fertilizer efficiency. Okay, summary, I'll just skip through this because it's basically everything I just said. If you want to keep up with me, I'm on Twitter at Travis Shaddox. I don't really do a whole lot recently on Twitter, although I guess I should, because apparently I'm speaking today because I was on Twitter. I guess I heard that, so I probably should be a little bit more interactive and engaged on Twitter. But I also update a lot of stuff on this website here. A lot of the new information and research comes out through there. We have extension publications that are coming out with a lot of this information in them through the University of Kentucky. So if you're ever interested in tracking me down or following me, this is the best way. My email's here and phone number and all that stuff. That's all I got, Xavier. Okay.
Hi, Travis. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really, really interesting. Let me say just words in Spanish. Bueno, pues ya veis que hasta aquí la presentación del doctor Travis Shaddox. Como sabéis, si queréis introducir las preguntas, o las podéis hacerlo de dos maneras, o introducirlas en el cuestionario, en el apartado de preguntas, o si estáis animados, os abro el micro y podéis hablar directamente con él. ¿De acuerdo? Travis, there are a couple of questions.
Okay.
The first one is, without considering economical reasons, why soil test analyses are still evaluated considering traditional guidelines?
You'll have to ask that again. I didn't quite understand you.
Okay, let me read it for you again. Without considering economical reasons, okay, while soil test analyses are still evaluated considering traditional fertilizing guidelines.
Why are they used? Or
yes. Let me explain. In other words, so why traditional guidelines are still used?
Okay.
Okay. Considering these scientists' evidences that less nutrients are needed to keep an acceptable turf grass.
I think I understand. Why are the current ones still being used, considering we have new
okay. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
That's a good question. I would say that if you are soil testing and you're sending your soils to be tested at a academic institution, I don't know what Spain has. I really apologize for not knowing more about your country in terms of soil tests. If you have an academic institution that is testing soils and they have faculty there that do these sorts of work, then those labs may use these values. Okay. I don't know what they use. If you're going to outside labs, say it's a business, an industry that they soil test as a business, I don't know where they get their numbers from. I have no clue where they get their numbers from in terms of how to interpret it. So the reason they're not using these values is because I don't know where they're getting their numbers from. I don't know if they're in communication with faculty who are developing these numbers. And there's very few of us, by the way. So I don't know how outside labs are doing it. Academic institutions who have faculty there should be using them or should be in the process of instituting sort of values that are similar to these. Okay, so why we're not using it, that's my best explanation. I will say that these values that were used for years and are currently being used were not wrong in the sense that they were the best evidence that we had at the time. You have to understand, turf grass has very little money compared to agriculture. And soil testing was designed to maximize yield and profitable return for farmers and for agriculture. That's the reason it was designed from the beginning. We've tried to use that in turf grass to aid our end users and our consumers to better manage nutrition. But all the numbers come from ag. So because turf chose to use those numbers is not necessarily wrong per se. It was just flawed. It was the best evidence we had to use. We didn't have any other numbers, so they used the best evidence they had. There's only, and I'm gonna throw a number out. I'm gonna say there's only 15, maybe 20 scientists, turfgrass academic turfgrass scientists in the world that actually investigate this and look at soil testing calibration and tissue calibration. There's not many of us. So I know this is a very long drawn out answer, but it's a question I've also often asked myself, why aren't we using these? And I just think it's because we haven't had the exposure to the same extent as agriculture has had with their soil test companies and so forth. I don't think we've really been able to expose these labs to these values. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer. I wish we were able to somehow provide these in a more uniform fashion so that these soil test labs around the world could at least get an idea as to what the numbers probably are relative to their current numbers, you know.
Okay, that was an excellent answer. Another question, please. In a basic words, could you explain why should we use why it's necessary to use Melic 3?
No, it's not. There's a lot of soil tests.
In a basic word, that's the most important.
Yeah. So Melic 3 is just an extractant. It's just an acid. That's all it is. There are many other extractants. You don't have to use Melic 3. You can use, in fact, there may be extractant more appropriate for your soils. Okay, Melic 3 is generally used now because it's more appropriate on acidic soils than in basic soils than Melic 1 is. So labs have, in most agricultural soils are acidic, at least in the United States. So they tend to prefer Melic 3 because it has been better correlated with anticipated responses. But there is absolutely no reason why Melic 3 has to be used in turf grass. It can be Olson, it can be Melic, it can be any of the extractants, as long as those extractants have a strong correlation between an extracted element and the response in turf grass to the application of that element. So there's absolutely no reason. Melic 3 does not have to be the only extractant on earth that everybody uses. It doesn't have to be that way. It just happens to be that way because agriculture runs the ship. Agriculture runs this whole boat that we're on. And in agricultural soils in the United States, generally Melic 3 happens to be the most appropriate one to use because it has the highest correlation from regression data. I don't know if that makes sense.
And for soils with pH close to 8?
Well, it depends. It kind of depends on what element you're looking at. If you're looking specifically at phosphorus, that might be one extractant. If you're looking at other elements like potassium, that might not matter. It might be a different extractant. So, do you know what you use in Spain? Does it say Melic 3 in your soils test, or does it say something else?
Not always is used Melic 3.
Not always. What do you know what it says when it's something else? Like what other extractant?
Right now, I don't remember the other soil test, but it's not commonly used.
Yeah, it's not commonly used. So there's probably a reason for if your pHs are 8. Well, definitely if they're 8, then there's probably a more appropriate pH or more appropriate extractant to use. And I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head what that might be. I can't remember. It's probably what you're using. I mean, if you're not using Melic 3 and your pHs are that high, you're probably using a more appropriate extractant in your soils.
Okay, thank you. And another question. The iron sulfate should be used no more than 6 kilo per hectare with spraying to have a negative effect in moss. Sorry.
Negative.
So let me read again, because the iron sulfate should be used no more than 6 kilo per hectare spraying to have negative effect in moss.
In moss? Moss? What's the word? Spell the word.
M-O-S-S.
Moss, yeah, moss. So when it comes to the application of iron sulfate to control moss, and I think that's more of a copper sulfate application. But that's you're starting to venture a little bit outside my specialty. So you start dealing with like disease suppression, excuse me, disease suppression and moss suppression with iron sulfate. I probably should know more about that, but I'll be honest, I don't. I don't know anything about that at all. There's pathologists and other algologists and things like that that are specialized more in that area. I will say that the 6 kilograms of iron per hectare that I recommend is based upon the likelihood of a phytotoxic response to the iron. So if you apply, let's say, 20 kilograms per hectare, you're probably going to result in a blackening of the turf, or at least a darkening of the turf. That's a result of burn. Whereas if you apply the 6 kilograms per iron per hectare, your risk of burn is lower. And even at that rate, the risk of burn is there, especially on wet grass. If you apply it in the morning when the grass has dew on it, and you apply that rate, you'll probably find the tips, the leaf tips, will be darker. It usually lasts for as long as maybe a week, depending on how fast the grass is growing. But I want to give people a safe rate whereby under normal conditions where you apply that rate, you're probably not going to result in a phytotoxic effect that is unacceptable. Okay, so you can apply very, very high rates if you want to, but much higher than 6 if you want to, and you can play with that rate. You can play, let's keep increasing it until we see what we want to see, or until we see a burn. But under normal conditions, people don't, well, I don't know if they do or not. I don't think people want to take that risk. So I use that rate as a good rate to use, such that they can apply it and not have to worry too much about burn. Yeah. There's somebody, I can't remember who it is, but there's somebody who specializes in iron sulfate with disease suppression. I can't remember who the gentleman is or the lady is, but that information's out there somewhere.
I think maybe that William Cruiser or Doug Soldat were working on dollar spot suppression using iron sulfate.
It might be. You might be right. Yeah.
I think there is something about it.
You might be right. I know Dr. Korzer does some work with iron as well. It may be him. I don't recall.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Travis Shaddox, that was the last question. Okay. So it was a pleasure for Campus del Césped to have you collaborating with us. So thank you very much again.
Very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so well, let me say goodbye to this in Spanish. Pues nada, hasta aquí la presentación del doctor Travis Shaddox de la Universidad de Kentucky. Si tenéis alguna otra pregunta, pues aprovecháis ahora, y si no, pues tenéis su contacto en la diapositiva que tenéis ahora en pantalla, o sea que podéis apuntaros su correo electrónico y bueno, o seguirlo en Twitter, que también es muy interesante, aunque dice que últimamente no está muy activo. Pues nada, por nuestra parte nada más. Nos vemos, en principio tenemos un otro webinar programado para el 9 de diciembre, ya haremos publicidad para que os podáis apuntar. Y nada, seguimos en contacto y trabajando para promover la formación de los gestores de céspedes deportivos. Thank you very much, Travis.
You're very welcome. Thank you for asking me to speak.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias. Adiós.
All right, how do I turn this off? Stop showing screen.